In order to enjoy the show, you will need a pair of red and cyan anaglyph glasses. These glasses are readily available on Amazon. And be sure to like and subscribe.
During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, stereopticons became a popular parlor item in many homes. A number of companies provided stereo cards, including Underwood and Underwood, who produced a series of travel and educational sets. For their Egypt tour, they recruited the distinguished scholar James Henry Breasted of the Oriental Institute to write the narrative. It was released in 1910. The result is the program you are about to see. We have taken the monochrome stereo cards and produced anaglyphic stereo images which can be viewed with red and blue glasses. During the show, there will be a map at the left of the photograph, often with an inset. This is to assist you in determining exactly where the picture was taken. Please put on your glasses now. The red lens goes on the left eye. Introduction by James Henry Breasted. In connection with the duties of university teaching and constant research, it has been my privilege to begin the work of making the public acquainted with the life, customs, history, and monuments of the ancient Egyptians. It was, therefore, with peculiar satisfaction that I made the acquaintance of this system of stay-at-home travel. By its use, an acquaintance can be gained with the wonders of the Nile Valley. It was in this conviction that I have undertaken the task of standing with the traveler at every point of view and to furnish him with the indispensable wealth of associations, of historical incident, or archaeological detail suggested by the prospects spread out before him. We have taken our stand out here on the south of Alexandria. Over behind those houses is the sea. We stand then with the whole African continent behind us and look towards Europe. The shaft before us was erected as a landmark for sailors by one of the Roman governors of Egypt. In the Middle Ages, it was mistakenly connected with the tomb of Pompey, who was murdered on this coast and has therefore been called Pompey's Pillar. We are at the southeast side of the city, facing northwest towards Alexandria, 130 miles away. For 2 miles, Cairo stretches out before us. The masonry on which we stand is part of the citadel built by Saladin in 1176 AD. The circular park with its rows of trees is where pilgrims returning from Mecca march in procession. The prominent building before us is the Mosque of Sultan Hassan. It was built in 1356 to 1359, and the Sultan was so delighted with it that he cut off the right hand of the architect so that he might never design another to be its rival. The city, of which we see the eastern edge on our right, did not originally include the site of the citadel before us. In 1176, Saladin began masonry fortifications on the height by that tall mosque, employing in the work hosts of European captives whom he took from the ranks of the Crusaders. The great mosque which surmounts the citadel was begun by Muhammad Ali in 1824. You are wondering at these tents and houses. These people have fulfilled the obligation of Ramadan, the first 3 days after which are devoted to feasting, rejoicing, and congratulations. These good people have chosen the cemetery as the place in which to celebrate their feast. This is commonly done. The hum of voices reciting the Quran, mingled with shouts and rejoicing of the poor at the gate of the cemetery as they receive food distributed by the rich, give a typical scene of Oriental life. We are near the eastern limits of the city, facing southwest. At the extreme left is the Mosque of Rifaiya. Between the dome with the peak awry and the distant sandhills is the court of the oldest mosque in Cairo, built in 877 to 879 AD by Ibn Tulun, the first independent sultan of Egypt. In his day, Cairo did not exist. The city which we have before us is mainly the work of the 14th century. It was in the city, as you see it from this point, that the Arabian Nights, with their charming pictures of the life of the common people, shops, houses, and bazaars, were put into final form. We are in the desert outside the city, looking a little west of north. These ladies of modern Cairo, who are out smelling the air, as they say, do not seem oppressed by the solemnity of the place. We look along the northern end of the line of royal tombs, which extends along the entire eastern side of the city, except where interrupted by the citadel, which is now behind us. These beautiful sepulchres were erected from the 13th to the 16th century by the Mamelukes, who followed the age of Saladin. We are in the eastern desert, outside the city wall, facing southwest. Here before us rises the lovely tomb mosque of Ka'et Bey, built in 1474, the last of the really great Mamluks. He inaugurated a golden age for Cairo, and brief as it was, the city was adorned with a host of magnificent buildings, which today form its chief architectural beauties. A mosque was originally only a place of assembly in the open air, a square court surrounded by colonnaded portico. When it became customary to bury the great in a mosque, a dome was placed over the tomb. The development of the minaret and the addition of a facade taken from the buildings of the Crusaders gave the tomb mosque a finished architectural unity. We find ourselves in a large hall of worship, which, in the original mosque form, was one side of a court, roofed over for the protection of worshippers. That niche marks the proper direction for prayer, towards Mecca. On the farther side of the prayer niche you observe the pulpit, from which the Friday sermon is delivered every week. The preacher is not specially ordained for his office, but may be any person of theological learning. There is nothing in Cairo like the ceremonies connected with the pilgrimage to Mecca. Every year a huge fabric for festooning the Kaaba at Mecca is made in Cairo, and we are now viewing the procession which is bearing it from the citadel to the mosque, where the pieces will be sewed together and lined in readiness for the departure of the pilgrims. We cannot here see the carpet itself, but the mamal, which accompanies it, is the curious object which you see at the head of the long procession. It is a pyramid of woven fabric richly embroidered, surmounting a roughly cubical base of the same material. The whole is stretched on a wooden frame and contains nothing. In this way, the mamal proceeds to Mecca with the pilgrims, and, with them, also returns to Cairo. The houses of the rich Cairenes give little indication on the outside of their interior beauty and riches. The ground floor, the carved doorway to which you see here on the right behind the tree, is reserved for the men. There the master of house receives his friends, who according to Muslim politeness must not give the slightest intimation that they are aware of the existence of any women in the house. The harem, the apartment of the women, is on the second floor. The elaborately carved windows are those of the harem, and there the ladies of the house spend their time, rarely going out. They lead the most uninteresting of lives. We are standing here in the National Museum of Egypt, a short distance from the Nile. The material of the statue is diorite, and although it is so hard that it turns the edge of a steel tool today, the artist with his chisel of copper cut the fine lines and delicate curves as if they were wrought in wood. Does this mighty pharaoh Khafra, who built one of the pyramids, look every inch a king? There he sits in calm and conscious superiority, before whom all men kiss the dust, of whom his son-in-law, and a great favorite, relates with pride that he is not merely permitted to kiss the ground, but by special grace might also kiss the pharaoh's toe. This self-satisfied Egyptian noble is a work of the old empire. In spite of the seams and scars of 5,000 years, the whole preserves an air of vivacity which is surprising. But what must it have been when it left the hand of the artist? This statue, as indeed was all Egyptian sculpture, was colored in the hues of life. These portrait statues were intended to be more durable bodies, false bodies, which should take the place of real bodies when the latter should have perished. Without such a body, the personality would be annihilated. This is King Seti I of the 19th dynasty. Though he appears almost as if he had died but yesterday, he lived and reigned over 33 centuries ago. The Hebrews were toiling in Egypt when the utterance of these very lips was the supreme decree of the state. Those arms, now folded in repose, once bore the sword in triumph. This tall form once towered in the speeding chariot, scattering death and destruction. The Egyptians believed that such a body as this was absolutely indispensable to the future existence of the person. The process of preservation was easy in the country of so dry a climate. When the climate was aided by artificial means, you see before you an amazing result. We are surrounded on all sides by treasured remains of the life of the oldest known civilization. A king was laid away in great state, wearing a splendid regalia of gold, silver, and costly stones. The result of this was that the tombs of the kings, the nobles, and the officials were systematically robbed. These luxurious adornments were found with the body of Queen Ahotep at Thebes in 1860. She lived late in the 17th century BC. This stone tablet is one of the most interesting, even here where there is so much of unusual interest. It is hewn out of black granite, 10 feet 3 inches high, 5 feet 4 inches wide, and 13 inches thick. On this side it bears a long inscription of King Amenhotep III, who lived in the middle of the 14th century BC. The inscription narrates the king's extensive temple buildings for the god Amun. Merenptah, the successor of Ramses II, appropriated it for his own mortuary temple. Placing it with the inscribed face to the wall, he inscribed on its back lines recording his victories. He says, Israel is desolated, his seed is no more. Palestine has become as widows for Egypt. This is the earliest mention of the Hebrews, their own literature being much later. Every day at noon, this long bridge over the river is open to permit the passage of the accumulated fleet. On our right is the city, now quite out of our field of vision. Before us and on our left is the river. As soon as the bridge is open, the craft from upriver pass quickly through by force of the current alone. Then we see the sails of the fleet from below maneuvering for position as at a yacht race, until, when the right point is reached, they make a dash for the draw. These rude craft once carried all the produce of Egypt, but since the construction of the railway and the introduction of the steamboat, their traffic has been much diminished. We have crossed the river Nile from Cairo and are facing west. It is nearly 5 miles from here to those world-famous pyramids. The nearer one is to the Great Pyramid of Khufu, the summit of which stands more than 450 feet above the drifting sands. Its base covers nearly 13 acres. At the foot of the bluff on our extreme left, you discern the houses of the modern village of Kafr. Little do the peasants who dwell in these villages dream of the life which once teemed and swarmed in busy streets occupying these very fields before us. For here lay the resident city of the 4th dynasty. Now all that remains of the city is a scanty remnant of the wall. With Cairo on our right and Memphis behind us, we look north-northwestward. Near to us rises the gloomy head of the Sphinx, gazing into the rising sun and guarding this city of the dead as he has done for 5,000 years. At the left are the palm-shaded graves of the Muslims. Already to the ancient Greeks, the pyramid was one of the marvelous survivors of antiquity, which they placed among the 7 wonders of the world. We are looking at the northwest corner of the Great Pyramid with Cairo on our left. The mass of the vast pile begins to grow, and we are ready to credit Herodotus' statement that its erection consumed the labor of some 100,000 men for 20 years. Here we may draw a contrast between Khufu's tomb and those of his contemporaries close to the pyramid at our right. These are but a few of the many masonry structures erected in the cemetery by the nobles and officials of Khufu. These masonry tombs, or mastabas, are not solid masonry. The exterior is only revetment covering a loose core of sand and rubble. In the east front there is a door giving access to a chamber where the deceased was supposed to enjoy the offerings of food, drink, and clothing which his surviving relatives placed there for him. Here the vast mass overpowers and overwhelms us. Here is the very embodiment of the ancient state of which the pharaoh was the soul. Think of the organization required to quarry these 2.3 million blocks, to transport them and lift them to the rising courses of this ever-growing monster. The capstone was 481 feet from the pavement. The base of the sea of stone which forms each face is 755 feet long. When completed, the pyramid was sheathed from summit to base in magnificent casing masonry, so skillfully set that the joints were almost undiscernible. It was still in place when the first Greek visitors beheld the pyramid. It was removed between the 13th and 16th centuries by the Muslims builders of Cairo. Is it possible that we stand at last upon the summit of the venerable monument of which we have so long dreamed? Behind us and on either hand are the silence and death of the desert. We are looking a little south of east, directly across the Nile Valley above the southern apex of the delta, which stretches away to the Mediterranean. Over on the horizon line are the cliffs marking the east side of the valley. Beyond, the Arabian desert extends to the Red Sea. Behind us, the Sahara rolls on to the Atlantic 2,000 miles away. The Nile is that broad white line coming into view at about the middle of our present view and running out of range at the left. We stand looking southwestward toward the heart of Africa. Before us looms the second pyramid. The cap of casing masonry, which still crowns it, extends for 150 feet down its sides. Farther east, to the left, you observe the upper end of a causeway leading from the plain to the desert plateau, by means of which, after the king's death, access was gained to the temple of the pyramid, where his mortuary ritual was regularly carried out on by an endowed priesthood. The ruins down at the left below our feet, seen over the standing native's head, are the remains of the temple of the second pyramid. That desolate, sand-covered ruin was once a splendid sanctuary of the dead Khafre who lay in the pyramid. We are now looking down the corner diagonally opposite the corner up which we ascended the pyramid. Let your eye run down the precipitous sides nearly 500 feet to the desert below. We are looking down here chiefly to observe those mastabas on the right. Do you see how the central core of sand and rubble is held in place by the retaining wall of surrounding masonry? There was a time when that retaining wall was just a circle of unhewn boulders to mark the resting place of his departed ancestor. As the mastaba has grown out of the sand heap, so the pyramid has grown out of the mastaba by placing one upon another. In the course of time, the terrace sides were filled in, and thus at last the pyramid form was attained. What we see here is the wreck of the ancient opening. It was originally closed by a slab of stone that was invisible from below. And to this, the fact that it was 24 feet east of the middle, and we shall understand how baffling it must have been for the tomb robbers. Nevertheless, they somehow gained a knowledge of it, and it was robbed in antiquity. It was later closed again, and all knowledge of the entrance lost. The son of the fatuous Harun ar-Rashid, whom we all know in the Arabian Nights, forced an entrance into the pyramid for the sake of the treasure which it was supposed to contain. The partially walled-up hole to the right is his forced passage. We are in the heart of the Great Pyramid, standing at the upper end of a sloping passage. The chamber where the king's sarcophagus was deposited is behind us. In order to go out into the open air, we should have to descend this passage and ascend another one, traversing a distance of nearly 250 feet. What a forbidding place! The bats, flitting hither and thither, whisk into our faces, draughts of the stifling air, superheated by the suns of 5,000 years. We are at the top of the grand hall, 157 feet long and 28 feet high. Up this superb hall the body of the king was borne on the day of burial. The chamber behind us, in which the body was to rest, is not less remarkable than the grand hall down which we look now. After descending 92 feet along one sloping passage and then ascending nearly 160 feet, we come into this chamber to which King Khufu's body was borne 5,000 years ago. Before us is the sarcophagus in which the king was entombed. Tomb robbers have broken away the corner in their mad search for treasure. Here we stand in the presence of the most graphic evidences of the futility of the Great Pyramid and of all the hopes that inspired its construction. As we stand here, we have Memphis behind us and Cairo on our right. We have ascended a ridge of sand, bringing into view this granite building. Mariette, who discovered the building in 1853, found a well from which he took no less than 7 portrait statues of Khafre, whose statue we saw in the museum, and the builder of the second pyramid. This building here was erected by him and belongs to the same period as the pyramids. It forms the entrance to the causeway, leading up to the pyramid temple on the east front of the second pyramid. This time-scarred, weather-beaten face looks out upon the plain as it has done these many thousand years. Behind it rises the second pyramid. In the age when that pyramid was being built, there arose here a promontory of rock which the king chose as the site and material for this statue. For you must know that the Sphinx is a symbolic portrait of the king. But already in remote antiquity, as far back as the 15th century BC, the windswept sands of the desert had driven in and covered it to the breast. Do you see standing between the 4 paws of the monster that large granite tablet? It contains an inscription which relates how, while he was still a prince, Thutmose IV of the 18th dynasty came hunting in this region, had a vision of the Sphinx appealing to him, and cleared away the sand. We stand on the Nile bottoms, 11 miles south of the cemetery of Giza. Here was Memphis, the great capital city which grew up in the Old Kingdom and became a metropolis of the ancient land. Greek travelers wrote of it, Greek poets sang of it, and in the days of the Roman Empire it was the goal of wealthy Roman tourists. In the 12th century AD, Arab writers speak of it as filled with an amazing host of marvelous monuments. But after that it began to serve as a quarry for building stone, and under the attacks of the Cairene architects of the Muslim sultans, its great walls and monuments gradually melted away. Such statues as this fallen portrait of Ramses II were placed by the kings of the empire in front of their temples. Giza and the Great Pyramid are now some 11 miles away, as we look upon this ancestor of the Great Pyramid. This terrace structure was built by King Zoser, a pharaoh of the 3rd dynasty. Let us remember him, for we shall find a curious inscription of his at the first cataract of the Nile. He first erected here a mastaba much like those later built at Giza. That mastaba is now in the heart of that strange terrace structure yonder, for he enlarged his original mastaba upon the ground, and also carried it upward by placing upon it a second mastaba smaller than the first. This process he repeated, producing at last the terraced structure as you see it now. We're in a hollow of the cliffs at the west side of the valley of the Nile, 7 or 8 miles south of Cairo. Do you remember those 2.3 million 2.5-ton blocks in the Great Pyramid? This is where most of them were taken out. Imagine the long lines of swarthy workmen tugging at the ropes as they drew out the massive blocks, the click of innumerable chisels as the blocks are hewn from the mountain, and the hoarse shouts of thousands of slaves mingled with the sharp call of the taskmaster and overseers. We are about 6 miles northeast of Cairo. This granite obelisk of King Senuseret I is the only considerable monument on this site to tell us that here rose once a magnificent temple in the heart of a great city. It was the oldest great religious center of ancient Egypt. During the empire, the temple was second only to that of Amun at Thebes in wealth and power. In Greek times, it was still famous for the wisdom of its priesthood. Tradition states that Plato studied 13 years here. The city itself was early destroyed, and Strabo, the geographer, found it in ruins in 60 BC. Our own obelisk, now in New York, once stood here with its fellow, which is now in London. We are in northeastern Egypt, between the Nile Delta and the Isthmus of Suez. The district at the left of this valley is the land of Goshen, where the Hebrews were given their homes and pasturage. We look northward across the desert toward an ancient canal. According to the biblical narrative, Pharaoh built the city of Pithom, where we now stand. Large portions of such a city are necessarily built of sun-dried brick. It is possible that the very bricks before us were made by captive Hebrews. Here you are up the Nile Valley of which we have so often spoken. You can see the tall cliffs which wall it in on the other shore. Similar cliffs rise behind us. In mid-river is a dahabeah, a long, narrow sailboat of a simple rig so common in the East. Divided approximately into halves, the forward half is devoted to the crew and the cook, while the aft half is occupied by the passenger cabin. The passenger cabin is surmounted by an awning-covered deck furnished with chairs, settees, hammocks, and a writing table. Below, the interior is divided into rooms. It is convenient and comfortable. The workmen just before us are transporting the large jars of which we see a long heap on the bank awaiting shipment. Such jars are made in great quantities in Upper Egypt. We are 15 miles west of the Nile, looking southeast. Cairo is off to our left, 50 miles away. These rough, sun-dried bricks at our feet form the summit of the Pyramid of Hawara, which stands in the mouth of the Fayum, and from this elevated point of view we are looking through the valley which connects the depression of the Fayum with the Nile Valley. The kings of the 12th dynasty took great interest in the Fayum. Here, a depression in the desert of some 30 by 40 miles has been flooded by the waters of the Nile inundation, which found access to the basin by the valley down which we are looking. By enormous hydraulic works, continued from rain to rain, the waters were pushed back, and the completion of a dike 27 miles long restored to cultivation some 27,000 acres of very productive land. For many thousands of years this device has been used. A pole with a weight on one end and a bucket hanging from the other is suspended at a point not far from that weight, which then, by its simple gravity, draws up the bucket when filled from the waters below. The apparatus is one of the simplest home construction. With this primitive equipment, the native raises the water from 4 to 8 feet. When the Nile is low, it is necessary to resort to a series of shadoufs, as they are called, one above another, till the level of the field is reached. The proper irrigation of 1 acre is usually counted as consuming the entire labor for 1 man at the shadouf. We are standing in a typical farming region. A small proportion of the Egyptian peasants are able to use another device for raising the Nile waters. A wheel, as it revolves over the water, carries an endless band of palm rope. Distributed at intervals along this band are earthen jars, which are carried down into the water, filled and continually raised to the top. A black-horned buffalo revolves a rude horizontal wheel, and as the animal walks slowly around, the whole ponderous machine is kept in operation. This Egyptian peasant is threshing his grain. The rich soil, fertilized every year by the black loam brought down by the inundation, yields 2 and sometimes 3 crops a year. But the methods employed are the most primitive in the world. They use the same wooden plow which we find depicted upon 5,000-year-old monuments. Thus, we see them here driving the threshing sledge, a rude wooden affair shod with iron teeth or cutting rollers, by which the grain is gradually crushed and loosened from the husks. The driver is protected from the blazing sun by a bower of straw over his head, while his incongruous yoke, a camel and an ox, move slowly around the circle. Here is the next step in the process of harvesting in Egypt. The mixture of broken straw, chaff, and grain is tossed into the air by the laborer, and as the heavier grain falls again to the threshing floor, the chaff and straw are carried away by the wind. It is a slow process, requiring the tossing of the mixture over and over again, but there gradually gathers on the windward side of the heap a mass of fairly clean grain. The precious pile that means bread for the peasant and his little ones slowly grows, until his comrade, who sits waiting on the ground with an empty basket by his side, may fill it with the winnowed grain and carry it to the neighboring granary. Just north of the chief ancient city of the Fayum, we stand looking nearly eastward. Behind us stretches the Fayum. Beyond the trees that mark the skyline before us, the Nile is 25 miles away. We see here modern natives engaged in brick making by the same methods that were employed 5,000 years ago. The soft mud is being mixed under the feet of a fella, while another at the table molds it into bricks. These are taken while still in the mold and carried to the yard by a third native, who gently detaches them from the molds and leaves them to dry in long rows. We are now on the eastern side of the Nile, almost midway between Cairo and Thebes. We stand on the face of a hill sacred to the great feudal lords of the 12th dynasty, for here tombs have been hewn out of the solid rock of the cliffs. That door before us gives access to the chapel chamber. The sepulchre chamber, where the mummy was deposited, is below the chapel, reached by a vertical shaft in the floor. Khnum-Hotep, who was buried here, was a feudal baron of the 12th dynasty. We stand on the west side of the Nile, with our backs to the modern town of Asut and the river, and look southwest. We are now 235 miles above Cairo. Before us rise the cliffs of the Nile Canyon. We shall presently climb those cliffs and look down upon the city, now behind us, the largest city of present-day Upper Egypt. Behind yonder desolate bluffs lies the Sahara, the sands of which have drifted down the face of the rock and closed many a tomb door. We are standing on the high cliff which walls in the west side of the Nile Valley as we look off over the town and the river. Beyond the town is the regular white band that marks the river. Beyond the river you see the valley spreading eastward to the distant cliffs, which show in dim gray upon the horizon. Behind them is the rocky waste of the Arabian desert, which rises to a range of granite mountains and then drops to the Red Sea. At this point the valley spread out before us is only some 10 miles wide. Between us and the town are the fields from which the inundation has just retreated. As we are looking southwestward here, the river is to our right. We are at Abydos, and Cairo is about 335 miles away. The priests of this place early affirmed that Osiris, the god of the dead, was buried here, and already at a remote date the ground on which you stand was the holiest spot in Egypt. Every great man desired to be buried here, or, if that were impossible, he erected a tablet on the wall of the ancient Osiris temple, the ruins of which are just out of range at our right. The temple before you was built by Seti I of the 19th dynasty. We have seen his face in the flesh in the museum at Cairo. Behind that row of pillars are 7 doors, which lead through the temple to 7 shrines. Seti never lived to see his temple finished, but on that wall facing us behind the pillars is a long inscription of his son Ramses II, telling how he completed the structure. We are at the southeast side of the second hypostyle hall. Just behind the row of columns at our left are 7 shrines, for Osiris, the king, and the great gods of Egypt. On our left the roof has now fallen in, hence you see how the sun shines in and the broad shadows of the columns are thrown obliquely across the pavement. On our right the columns are modeled on the bud of the papyrus plant. The bud forms the capital and the stem of the plant is the shaft. This relief shows the figure of the king, Seti I, whom we have seen in Cairo. His son, the prince who became Ramses II, stands before him, reading from a double roll of papyrus. In the ruled column before him you notice a number of ovals. These cartouches contain kings' names. Here there are 3 long rows of them, 76 kings in all. Seti and his son are pronouncing a sacrificial ritual for the benefit of their great predecessors on the throne. This list, which they intend for pious purposes alone, is now one of the most important documents known for the reconstruction of Egyptian history. It begins with Menes, the king of the first dynasty at least 3,000 years BC, and ends with Seti I in the 14th century BC. Standing before the Dendera temple and looking directly southward, Abydos is our right. Thebes, now but 40 miles distant, is before us. Here is one of the best preserved temples in Egypt. The part which we see was built under the Roman Emperor Tiberius in the 1st century AD. The halls in the rear were the work of the Ptolemies, so this temple marks for us the transition from Greek to Roman domination in the Nile Valley. These heaps are rubbish which was once part of a town. The walls of the houses have gradually accumulated as dust and mud. Generation after generation of such houses tumbled down, until the town no longer stood upon a plain but upon a mound. The temple pavement and the base of the walls are far below the surface of these heaps. We are facing southeast. This is the plain of Thebes. Here the mighty city stretched its vast length across the plain. The one-time mistress of the world, the theme of Homer's song, ancient Thebes was two cities, a city of the dead on this western plain, and a city of the living on the eastern plain. Take off your glasses and rest your eyes for a minute. Thebes rose to a splendor and magnificence unknown before. Laden with the spoils of Asia and Nubia, the conquerors of the 18th and 19th dynasties returned to this lovely, cliff-encircled plain to adorn it with the mightiest temples that have ever risen by human hands. Thus it became the first great monumental city in the history of the world. It continued to be embellished by further buildings or additions to the old ones until Roman times. In the height of its glory, its fame had penetrated to the remotest peoples. Homer sang of it. Not all proud Thebes' unrivaled walls contain the world's great empress on the Egyptian plain that spreads her conquests over 1,000 states and pours her heroes through 100 gates. As the nation declined and the seat of power passed to the delta, the city fell into decay. It was, however, with the invasion of the Assyrians in the 7th century BC that its colossal temples fell prey to fire and sword. The proud city was, however, not annihilated and headed insurrection after insurrection until, in resisting the institutions of Roman authority under Augustus, it was taken by the Romans, who laid it utterly waste in 29 BC. Time to put your glasses back on. What would the proud conquerors of the 18th dynasty think could they have foreseen the tower of this Muslim sanctuary rising in the midst of the temple court? We are looking southwestward, parallel or nearly so with the Nile, which we see on the right flowing towards us. Karnak and its great temple are behind us. Where now stand those beautiful colonnades, there was once a small sanctuary of the Theban god Amun. In the 18th dynasty, Amenhotep III replaced it by a more pretentious temple than any which his ancestors had anywhere planned. He raised yonder colonnaded hall, before which he laid out a court, surrounded by a colonnade on 3 sides. The pylon on which we have just stood is there at the right of the obelisk. Such a pair of towers usually form the entrance of an Egyptian temple. Part of the interior is hollow, with a staircase leading to the top. Notice that row of holes made by the later dwellers in this court, long after it had ceased to be used as a sanctuary, that they might insert the ends of the timbers supporting the roof of their house. The other walls of the house were built of brick, sun-dried and therefore friable. As the centuries passed and house after house fell to ruins, the ancient court gradually filled with rubbish and crumbled brick until the houses of today, like yonder mosque, stand upon an accumulation 30 feet deep. The Nile is on our right. We look almost due south. Cairo is far away behind us. There is not another such group of columns as these in all of Egypt. Look at these fine contours as the shaft rises to the beautiful capital. Each column is a cluster of papyrus buds, which form the capital, while the stems below make up the shaft. Imagine such a colonnade, painted with all the bright hues of the tropic verdure which they represent. As you look into the noble court, the central aisle leads back to the Holy of Holies. Down that aisle the august image of the god was borne when he came forth to celebrate some great feast. We have the pylon of the temple before us. We are standing on 25 or 30 feet of debris. If we were standing on the temple pavement, that colossus at the right would be some 40 feet high. These natives whom we see carrying water in the old way are very tenacious of their right in these mud brick houses in which they live. The excavator has no right to remove these dwellings. Notice those relief sculptures on the left-hand tower where we see Ramses II charging the enemy in his chariot. This obelisk before us, like the pylon, was erected by Ramses II. Its fellow was removed to Paris in 1832, where it now stands in the Place de la Concorde. Up to within a very few years, you would have been looking upon the garden patches of the neighboring villagers. But now the government has brought up the necessary ground, and you are able to gain some impression of what the approach to the sanctuaries of Egypt was like. The soldiers of Assyria in plundering bands have marched down this avenue. Persian hordes have swarmed through it. Alexander's phalanxes have trodden it. The legions of Rome have wrecked it. And the Muslims have shattered its sculptures. Amenhotep III, the king to whom these avenues are in large part due, constructed them to connect Luxor and Karnak. We stand here at the rear of the Karnak temple looking northwest. In general, the oldest portions of the temple are nearest us, here in the rear, and the most recent at the other end. A modest chapel of Amun was built here in the 12th dynasty. It was enlarged both in front and rear by the great conquerors of the 18th dynasty. Their additions in the rear are the walls immediately before us, while those in the front extend to a fallen pylon just behind the smaller obelisk. On the other side of that obelisk begin the enlargements of the 19th dynasty. Here in these expanding halls we see embodied the career of the Egyptian nation, dynasty after dynasty, till it closes with the Ptolemies. We stand before the greatest pylon in Egypt. The river Nile is behind us, Luxor is on our right, and we look through the main entrance of the temple and down the main axis. Behind and to the left of that isolated column in the court, you may see the gate of the second pylon. This enormous pylon before us is the latest portion of the building. This scene furnishes us another good example of the way in which the rubbish and debris of fallen houses collect before and around and within the temples of Egypt. Excavations have been going on here for many years, but there is still much to be done. Here, for 10 cents a day, the modern native carries away the remains of the houses of his ancestors to uncover remains of his still older forefathers. This is the same avenue after being excavated by native workmen. It was Ramses II who erected this splendid avenue of sphinxes. The row on the right is in an unusually good state of preservation, and you observe the statues of the king standing between the protecting forepaws of each ram. The ram was the sacred animal of Amun, the great god of Thebes, hence its use as the exclusive figure in the sculpture along the Theban avenues. Here the splendid festal processions of Amun passed, but now it sees nothing more impressive than a straggling line of Cook's tourists riding up to the gate on donkeys. What a scene of desolation. Do you wonder that the destruction of this great city stirred the peoples to the ends of the earth? The vengeance of Assyria, Persia, and Rome in the earthquake of 27 BC have wrought the ruin before us from the greatest architectural achievement of Oriental history. We are standing upon the northern tower of the first pylon and looking down the length of the temple toward the east. Under our feet is the latest portion of the building. Before us, the great court of somewhat earlier date, leading to the hypostyle hall of the 19th dynasty, behind which you see the obelisk which marks the beginning of the works of the 18th dynasty. Those two shapeless masses of tumbled stone on either side of that door once formed the two towers of the second pylon, built by the pharaohs of the 19th dynasty. Even in the hazy past, the Greeks knew about 100-gated Thebes, and quoted it as the supreme embodiment of power and splendor. Now the city has vanished, and only parts of its great temples, like this one, remain to tell of what which used to be. There are 132 of these columns. It is 65 feet up to the top of those spreading capitals, and it would take 6 men with outstretched arms to span one of the shafts. In 1899, 11 columns in this hall fell owing to age and insecurity of the foundations. The debris from the fall have been removed, and the government is replacing the columns as they were before. There are the two obelisks which we saw from the rear of the temple. The side aisles of the great hall now spread out on each side of the central aisle before us. The side columns which are hidden behind the walls are 43 feet high. Those in the middle aisle are 22 feet higher, and the resulting difference in the height of the roofs is utilized for the insertion of a row of windows. You will immediately recognize in this arrangement the Basilica Hall of Roman architecture. The sacred lake is now the wallowing pool for the buffaloes of the neighboring peasantry. The first two columns, one on each side, have been repaired at some period with rough masonry. The four nearly perfect ones on the right convey very effectively the grandeur and somber beauty which an Egyptian architect expressed in his great colonnade. See those vast architraves, each resting upon the capital of a column? Those architraves upheld the now vanished roof, of which a few fragmentary pieces may be seen. What the hand of man did not destroy, the earthquake has laid low, until the columns rise in nakedness to the sky, flooded with sunshine. We are now looking northward with the sacred lake behind us. On our left, with just the northernmost corner showing, is the great hall above which rises the smaller obelisk of Thutmose I. Under Thutmose's daughter Hatshepsut, this hall suffered strange alteration. She placed her obelisk in it, although she was obliged to unroof it. She tells in an inscription on its base how she did it all in response to an oracle of the god Amun, and states that the obelisks were taken from the quarry in a brief space of 7 months. The great obelisk is 97 feet high and 8.5 feet square at the base, being the largest now in Egypt. Of its fallen companion, only this upper part before us survives. Its pyramidal point was covered with an alloy of gold and silver, which, glittering in the sun, might be seen from afar.
We are in a chamber just north of the Holy of Holies, built by Thutmose III in the rear of the temple. Here he has depicted upon the wall the plants and animals of Palestine and Syria, which he brought back with him from his campaign there. At the other end, now out of range, is Thutmose III's inscription about them. He says, "Year 25, under the majesty of the king of Egypt, Thutmose III, living forever. Plants which his majesty found in the land of Syria. All plants that grow, all flowers that are in the divine land, which were found by his majesty, when his majesty proceeded to Syria to subdue the countries according to the command of his father Amun, who put them under his feet." We are standing outside of the great hypostyle of Karnak, looking southward against the outside of the north wall. Behind this wall is the vast forest of columns which we have already viewed. In 3 rows, one above the other, Sethos I, the father of Ramses II, has here depicted the victories which he won in the first years of his reign in the middle of the 14th century BC. These reliefs before us belong to a period long after that of the builders of the Great Hall. They were put here by King Shishonk, the first king of the 22nd dynasty, who began to reign about 945 BC. He desired to recover Egypt's conquest in Palestine, which had been lost by his predecessors. Do you see the god Amun? His left hand grasps a number of cords extending to the line of captives. Each captive is merely a head and a pair of pinioned arms attached to an oval containing the name of the city. These long rows of ovals form a list of the cities of Palestine which Shishak captured. We are now on the west side of the Nile looking north. Here once stood a temple erected by Amenhotep III, and the 2 colossal statues, intended as portraits of himself, adorned its front. The earthquakes of 27 BC overthrew the upper portion of the farther colossus, and shortly after it was noticed that this statue emitted a cry every morning at sunrise. The Greek residents of Egypt immediately averred that the figure must be that of Memnon, the famous son of Eos the Dawn. He had fallen in the Trojan War, and now, they said, he greets his mother with every returning morning. Before us rise the cliffs that flank the western plain of Thebes. We are standing at the east end of the Ramesseum and hooking toward its western end. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom no longer built pyramids, but hewed out vast tombs in a valley behind yonder cliff, and here, to the east of those cliff tombs, are the royal mortuary temples. When the priest-kings of the 21st dynasty could no longer protect the royal mummies from tomb robbers, they dug a secret shaft in the face of the cliff before us. In that chamber, the mummies of Egypt's greatest kings were assembled. They were discovered there some 20 years ago. We see the white front of the hotel at Luxor, or the other side of the Nile, which flows directly in front of it. The vacant space before us is the second court of the temple, with its Osiris columns in front and rear. Those in front now face us, and of the 4 in the rear you can discern only the arm or elbow of one projecting from behind the pillar down here at our left. There, with his giant head reposing directly in the middle aisle, is the colossal statue of Ramses II, the builder of this temple. In the year 1300 BC it towered grandly above the pylons, but it has long lain as you see it now. The trees which form that broken line against the faint background of the distant eastern cliff mark the course of the river. The level fields are dotted here and there with threshing floors. Yonder in the midst of the broad plain are the colossi looking out upon the Nile. Here at our feet, as we stand upon the higher roof of the central aisle of the Ramesseum, are the roofing blocks of the side aisles. The block on which our native servant lies is some 18 or 19 feet in length. We have climbed the western cliffs and stand in the midst of the innumerable tomb openings, which we saw from the Ramesseum below. Just over the head of the native sitting on the spur of rock, you see the mass of buildings making up the group of Medinet Habu. Here at our feet are a few of the tombs. Many a fine inscription or important paintings has been destroyed because a native has lived in the tomb chamber himself with his family or kept his buffalo cow and his chickens there. The little white house directly before us, with 5 windows in the front and flanked by a group of trees, is the house of Mr. Percy Newberry, who has carried on excavations in the Theban cemetery for years. The entrance to this tomb is, at present, a mere hole in the ground. This is the tomb chapel which served as the abode of an Egyptian officer who lived early in the 16th century BC. It is 3,500 years since the artist who painted this chamber stood where you and I stand now and looked over his work for the last time before turning it over to its owner. We are stationed at one side of a nearly square chamber, the whole of which is hewn out of the western cliffs. This is the room where the deceased lives and receives food and drink from his surviving relatives and descendants. We are at the western limit of the great Theban plain on the left bank of the Nile facing north. What temple in all the world is so superbly situated as this beautiful sanctuary of the great Queen Hatshepsut? The snow-white colonnades are flanked by the desolate cliffs with their fine play of light and shadow, against which the clear lines of the temple are sharply defined, producing an effect not to be found in any other temple of Egypt. A causeway connects the upper and middle court. A similar causeway, which you notice at the extreme right, connects the middle and lower court, of which you can see only one corner just behind this house on the right. That is the house of the excavators who freed this temple from the accumulated debris that covered it. We are at the left side of the upper court of Hatshepsut's temple and are looking at the end wall. These reliefs record an Egyptian expedition under Queen Mtkara to a district at the south end of the Red Sea, now known as the Somali coast. On the right is the file of soldiers. At the extreme left, where the wall is broken off, you see the prince of the land of Punt, standing in salutation of the Egyptians. Over the table and the Egyptians are the words, "The arrival of the king's messenger in the divine land, Punt, together with the army which is behind him, before the chiefs of Punt. They have been dispatched with every good thing from the court of Egypt." Over the prince of Punt we find the coming of the chiefs of Punt, doing obeisance with bowed head, to receive the army of the king. We are looking southeast, our line of sight being at right angles with the river which you discern as a white streak. Below us, hidden by the rocks at our feet, is the terraced temple of Deir el-Bahari, at the foot of the cliffs. That rectangular brick building is the tomb of the 26th dynasty. The temple of the great conqueror Thutmose III stood out yonder on the plain, but like all the other temples in that splendid line, it has utterly vanished. Here is the rugged crest of the rocks which flank the temple of Deir el-Bahari, as we saw them from below when we visited the temple. We are now looking down the river. On our right, but out of our field of vision, is Karnak. On our left, the desert. Far down the valley is the river which cut out this remarkable valley and made it a habitable land. These cliffs before us and all that we have thus far seen are of limestone. But as we proceed up the river, we shall find them changing to sandstone, which continues throughout Nubia. We are now standing with Karnak and the river behind us. Out yonder, behind that battlemented mountain, are the trackless wastes of the Sahara. The valley at our feet is a depression behind the western cliff, which we have seen from the plain of Thebes behind us. When the kings found that the pyramids no longer sufficed to protect the body of the royal occupant, they began to follow the example of their nobles and hewed out tombs in the rock of the cliffs. The place they chose was this valley, and you can see the door that formed the entrances to their tombs. The custom began when the kings of the empire took up their residence at Thebes. From the time of Thutmose I, early in the 18th dynasty, after 1550 BC to about 1000 BC, this valley continued to be the royal cemetery of Egypt. Do you see that open door facing us? That belonged to Ramses VI. Just at the left of that door, you notice a pathway leading obliquely up to the face of the opposite cliff. There, in the winter of 1898, M. Lorette discovered the tomb of Amenophis II. And there his body still lies, garlanded in its ancient funeral wreaths, just as they were put there on the day of burial over 3,300 years ago. The last tomb discovered was found by an American, Mr. Theodore M. Davis. It was that of the family of Amenophis III. This excavation in the mountain is the tomb of King Seti I. This gallery before us goes down through successive halls 330 feet into the mountain. At the end, in the last chamber, was a vast stone sarcophagus in which the king was interred. The sarcophagus is now in Sir John Soane's museum in London. The body of the king you have already seen in the Cairo Museum. To enable tourists to see without the use of smoky torches, the government has put in electric lights. You can see them leading along the ceiling of this gallery. We face almost due north with the river on our right and the cliffs on our left. Behind us is the western plain of Thebes. This is really a composite chapel for the kings of 3 generations. In the wall behind these papyrus bud columns are 3 doors. This first door leads to the chapel of Ramses I. The middle door leads to the main sanctuary, that of Seti I. The farthest door, which we cannot see, leads to the hall of Ramses II, who completed the building. The main sanctuary is also sacred to Amun, the state god. This temple marks for us the beginning of the 19th dynasty in the middle of the 14th century BC. This is the best preserved temple which we have yet seen. On our right is the southern end of the western plain, beyond which are Luxor and the Nile. On the wall, in relief, we see the king slaying his captives before Amun. The god presents to King Ramses III a list of cities and countries which covers the whole front of the pylon below them. The temple is a chronological record of the reign of this king, which contains some of the most severe wars through which Egypt ever passed. The reliefs on this side of the temple on the wall behind the first pylon are devoted to the peaceful pursuits and religious duties of the king. On the back of the pylon is a wild bull hunt. The king urges on his plumed horses as they dash after the great bull, plunging through the reeds in the vain endeavor to escape to the river. The eager pharaoh leans far over the front of his chariot as he strains to reach the fleeing prey. Beneath the horses, we see a victim brought down upon his back. The river itself, which occupies the lower right-hand corner, is filled with fish, and towards its curving shore marches a line of the king's archers. In such pastimes as these, the warlike pharaohs of the empire were wont to spend their time. This is the massive side wall of the temple enclosing the second court. At the top of the wall, in hieroglyphs over 2 feet high, is a long inscription reciting the power and might of the pharaoh. Below are exploits which justify this laudation. Do you observe the king standing just behind the chariot? A heroic figure, he discharges a hail of arrows among the foe. You can hardly discern them, but the people who are attacking the king's fleet are called people of the sea in the inscription. One such tribe settled on the coast of Palestine and became the Philistines of Hebrew times. We have sailed upriver and taken up our position on the eastern cliffs, and look across the eastern plain, the river, and the fields on the other side to the distant western cliffs. Thebes is now 44 miles off to our right. That somber gray wall is the fortified wall of the city known to the ancient Egyptians as Nakhan. It is the only city wall which has survived, practically intact, from such a remote age in any country. It was erected not less than 2,000 years before Christ, and possibly much earlier. In historic times, it was the seat of powerful barons who had much to do with the rise of Thebes. Their tombs fill the cliffs here, and the walls of their chambers bear many a heroic story of battle and victory in the pharaoh's cause. There is no ancient temple which can compare with this in preservation. There was, of course, a much older temple on this spot, but this present building was begun by Ptolemy III in 237 BC. We are looking across the court eastward to the plains that fringe the river and the eastern cliffs rising behind them. Behind the temple are a few whitewashed houses of modern Edfu. Immediately in front of the wall is a section of sun-dried brick construction, part of a house built against the temple. The accumulations from such houses had almost completely covered the temple until it was excavated by Mariette. What a superb landscape! The broad plain, broken up into fertile fields and sprinkled with graceful palms and fleecy acacias, merges into the river, behind which the yellow cliffs mingle with the pale skyline beyond. The soft lines of the landscape contrast strongly with the sharp rectangular contours of the houses of the town. We stand on the western pylon and look northward. At our feet is the first court. Behind is the vestibule. This broad band of sunshine falls through a square hole in the roof. We are now standing where only the king and high priest were allowed to enter, in the Holy of Holies of the great Horus Temple of Edfu. On the left is the very shrine in which the sacred image of the god was kept. The edict of the Roman Emperor Theodosius in 378 AD forbade all further worship of the old gods and at last nominal adherence to Christianity. But the edict could not at that time be enforced here in Upper Egypt. The service of Horus in this temple may have gone on for 100 years more. The first cataract of the Nile is on the right, above the islands where the native boy is pointing. We look southward across the river. The northern end of the island of Elephantine in the foreground, and the modern town of Aswan on the other shore. Aswan has long marked the southern limit of Egypt proper. The important town of early Egyptian times was located on the large island out there, at its farther end. The nobles who lived here were employed by the pharaoh in trading expeditions in the remote south. They were the frontiersmen of that ancient day. We have now before us the tomb in which one of the most noted of them was buried. The man who built it, a nobleman named Harkuf, lived under the kings of the 6th dynasty. Here on the front wall of his tomb, Harkuf has left a remarkable record of his life. He discovered one of the pygmies which have so astonished modern explorers of Africa, and brought the tiny midget back to Egypt with him. This so delighted the king that he wrote Harkuf a special letter expressing his gratification. Harkuf had it engraved on the front of this tomb, and to this fact we owe the preservation of the oldest royal letter in the world. On the southeast side of the Elephantine Island is this interesting device for measuring the inundations. After ages of use, the ancient instrument was restored to service by Ismail Pacha in 1870. It is very important at each stage of the inundation to know whether the rise is equaling that of good years, or whether it is likely to fall short and cause famine and distress. Down at the bottom where the boy stands, the masonry is open to the river, so that the water in here rises with the rise of the stream. You can see the graduated marks on the side wall. These granite quarries, where the Egyptians found stones suitable for their buildings, lie on the east bank of the Nile a few miles south of Aswan. Recall the huge obelisks which we have seen at Heliopolis, Karnak, and Luxor.
We are now in the quarry from which those vast monoliths came.
This prostrate giant is still a part of Mother Earth from which he has never been separated. After being broken free from the native rock beneath, it would have then been dragged upon a huge sledge to the river and loaded upon a barge, preparatory to floating it down the river. The reliefs of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari show 2 of her obelisks being towed upon a huge barge. The channel of the Nile for a distance of 5 miles is filled with the granite islands which caused the cataract. The rocks on these islands are covered with inscriptions. They form the most ancient and most interesting visitor's book in the world. Century after century and dynasty after dynasty, from 2600 BC onward through Roman times, kings and nobles, scribes and officers have left their record here. This inscription purports to be an official communication from King Zoser of the 3rd dynasty, telling of the king's great anxiety because there had been no inundation for 7 years. The king had summoned to his presence one of the great wise men, Imhotep by name, who reported that the god Khnum was the controlling divinity at the cataract. The king ordered a sacrifice, and that night in a dream, Khnum appeared to him and promised to cause the regular and unfailing rise of the Nile thereafter. Set like a peerless gem among the wild, desolate rocks of the cataract, this temple has preserved more of the romance of the Nile than any other spot in Egypt. We are facing south. Behind us is Aswan. Just in the middle of our prospect, you observe the pylons of the Temple of Isis. There must have been a shrine of Isis on this island long before the present temple was built, but the earliest mention of the place in Egyptian inscriptions is about the middle of the 4th century BC. We are looking northeastward. Over on the right is the square kiosk which the natives called Pharaoh's Bed. It dates back from the Roman age. The building with the large pylon is the Isis temple. Isis was the great divinity of the place. The fame of her power spread far and wide, and in time she was worshipped from the Danube and the Seine to the upper cataract of the Nile. Roman ladies journeyed to this shrine to carry home the sacred waters that bathed the island. So powerful was the priesthood of this temple that the Edict of Theodosius in 378 AD, forbidding the continuance of pagan worship, could not be enforced here until the reign of Justinian in 527 AD. That long, low wall out there means bread for the peasant, but destruction to this beautiful monument of his ancestors. The Great Barrier which you see yonder is the greatest dam that was ever built. The foundation stone of the vast structure, which is 1.25 miles long, 100 feet high at the deepest part, and 88 feet thick at the bottom, was laid in 1899, and it was completed in 1902. When a contemplated increase in the height of the dam is completed, the temples will be largely submerged. It is therefore only a matter of time when this lovely spot will become a mud-covered, desolate waste. We stand on the west side of the Nile, looking nearly eastward across the temple of the ancient town now called Calabsha. This is Nubia, and the people about us speak the Nubian tongue. As Egyptian civilization gradually spread in the country, the pharaohs built temples here after the Egyptian style. The sanctuary before us was built in the days of the Roman Emperor Augustus. We view it from the rear on the high ground of the sandstone bluffs. It is the most picturesque temple in Nubia, with the exception of Abu Simbel. We are on a lofty fortified rock on the east bank, and we look down the river, which flows at this point about northeastward. The river winds through the sandstone tableland, with but a narrow fringe of vegetation on either hand. In the days of Abraham, the pharaohs conquered this territory, adding over 200 miles of Nile Valley to their kingdom. About 1580 BC, the conquest was gradually pushed further south until the Fourth Cataract was made the frontier. In the 8th century BC, this region regained its independence and maintained itself as a separate kingdom far down into the Christian centuries. Nubia continued as a Christian power until the conquest of the Muslims in 640 AD. When modern travelers rediscovered Abu Simbel, the descriptions of its glory which reached Europe were considered wild exaggerations. That front is 119 feet wide and over 100 feet high. The 4 gigantic colossi which adorn the facade are each 65 feet in height, and they, as well as the whole front and interior chambers, were hewn from the mountain as they stand. It was wrought by Ramses II, the author of the most colossal works in Egypt. We are standing just south of the southernmost of the 4 colossi, and with the river down at the right and the cliffs at our left. We face north. How puny appears the figure of that tall native! He is not longer than the beard of the nearer figure. The pharaoh sits in the ceremonious posture demanded of the divine ruler, with hands reposing on his knees. He wears the double crown, symbolic of his double realm of Upper and Lower Egypt. The head is beautifully wrought, and the expression of the face is one of kindness and benevolence, combined with that impressive calm and a subtle touch of oriental indolence. We stand here on the sand, which sifts in continually on the north side from the desert behind the cliffs and threatens to engulf the temple. It has been several times cleared away, and it can be kept out only by the closest vigilance. The legs of the further 2 colossi bear a number of Phoenician and Greek inscriptions, one of which, on the legs of the fallen colossus, is of great interest, being among the oldest known Greek inscriptions. It was placed there by soldiers of King Psammetichus early in the 6th century BC. We are standing in the entrance door looking westward directly down the main axis of the temple. The river and the rising sun are behind us. The great vestibule hall expands before us. The 8 massive Osiris pillars which support the roof are 30 feet high. They represent Ramses II in the form of Osiris. Looking through the door opposite us, we see the hypostyle hall. The door yonder leads to a transverse antechamber, beyond which is the Holy of Holies. Through that last door we discern in the dim light the figures of 2 of the 4 gods who occupy it. These are Amun-Ra, the state god, and Ramses II himself. The 2 others are Ptah and Re-Horakhti, but they are cut off from our view by the doorpost on either side. We are now nearly 1,000 miles from Alexandria and the sea. Our point of view is on the west, and we look northeastward over the wild prospect of the Second Cataract. This was the frontier of the Middle Kingdom, whose kings first made conquest of Lower Nubia. In 1883, under their skillful leader, the Mahdi, the local tribes drove back the British to this cataract. The frontier post of the English then became Wadi Halfel, about 5 miles downstream, directly on our present line of sight. Omdurman is on the left bank of the White Nile, just where the Blue Nile flows into it. As we stand, both rivers are on our right, but out of range. We face northeast, that is, downstream. Khartoum is also on our right, but out of range, on the south bank of the Blue Nile, just above its junction with the White Nile. When Gordon entered Khartoum in 1884, in the endeavor to save the Sudan from the Mahdi, he rode to his death. It was not until 1896 that the Egyptians under British officers, and with a nucleus of English regulars, advanced for the recovery of the Sudan. Native Egyptian troops blew up the tomb of the Mahdi before us, and thus prevented it from becoming a shrine. The tomb is a low, roofless building with arched windows surrounded by a court. The low roof on the right side beyond the court is the Mahdi's house. We look a little south of westward across the Blue Nile and the city of Khartoum on the opposite side of the river. The town was founded by Muhammad Ali in 1823 and soon became a flourishing trade center for the Sudan. Out there on the left side of the first smokestack is the palace in which the governor lives, built on the spot where Gordon fell. This boat nearest us is taking on troops for transport to Fashoda, 510 miles further up the White Nile. This service involves danger, and the steamer is armored for its work. The forward windows of the pilot house show iron shutters, which may be closed in time of danger, leaving only a slit through which to see and to thrust the deadly rifle. But the boats, though prepared for war, are messengers of civilization, penetrating to the heart of Africa. Epilogue. And here we take final leave of this remarkable river and the valley it wrought. The remotest monuments of ancient Egypt are over 400 miles below us here, and the pharaohs never dominated the country on either side of this Blue Nile. We have seen the traces of ancient Egypt gradually disappear, until at this point we stand on the verge of the great uncivilized heart of Africa, from which the river flows. Possibly the adventurous nobles of Elephantine had already penetrated in their trading expeditions to this junction of the two rivers, but the country above it has always lain in complete darkness. Today it is in much the same material condition in which the trading Egyptians must have found it nearly 5,000 years ago.